The effect of British troops also end up being things like the Boston Massacre. There's a lot of unhappiness by the colonists for having to pay for them to live there when they're not really, their ideas are protecting. Who are you protecting us against in Boston? Ourselves? Okay? So there's a lot of resentment, and finally in Boston one day it boils over. Americans kind of in a mob mentality get together and start heckling some British soldiers in front of a customs house. It's not enough to just yell things that are insult at them because the British aren't responding. And so they start throwing snowballs at and ice chips at the British soldiers, and they don't maybe respond enough then, so they pack rocks with snow, a rock inside of a snowball, and then they throw that. And eventually a British soldier fires at them, and some Americans are killed. Less than 10 are killed. I don't remember the exact number, but it's not very many. Okay? 7, that sounds familiar too. Anyway, Americans call that a massacre. The first person to die was a free black man named Crispus Attucks. But we keep bringing this up to the British. The soldiers were all tried for murder. Ultimately, they were all found not guilty of murder, so they were hanged, they were branded, and sent back to England. But the person who defends them is John Adams, because he believes everybody has the right to a defense. Okay? Intolerable coercive acts were passed as a result of what? The Boston Tea Party. So Britain passes a Tea Act. They pass a Tea Act to take, so instead of the tea going from Ceylon or Sri Lanka as it's known today, to England, to the United States, it can go directly from the British East Indies, from Sri Lanka, to the colonies. So what does that really do to the price of tea? It lowers it, right? Because you take out the middleman. So why are colonists mad? They see this as a trick. The British are trying to get us to pay taxes. And if you buy that tea, you're saying it's okay to pay taxes, which is what exactly the British would have done, okay? So all this, thousands and thousands of pounds of tea are sitting in a ship off in the Boston port, and it's going to, by law, going to have to be unloaded and sold at auction, and the colonists don't want that to happen, so they dump all 90,000 pounds of it into the Boston Tea Harbor. Britain is furious, so that's when they pass the Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts as they call them. The Intolerable Acts have 4 parts. First, the Boston Port Act. Boston Port is closed until the colonists make restitution. Did they ever make restitution? No. The Massachusetts Government Act, which says there can be no town meetings, no colonial legislature, whatever. We, the British, are now in charge of Massachusetts. 3, the Administration of Justice Act, which says if you're a British official and accused of a crime, you can choose to go back to England to stand trial. And 4thly, a new quartering act, which allowed the British to quarter in buildings inside the city if they needed to. Okay? Did you have to worry about sharing your bedroom with British soldiers in the colonial times? No, that's one of those myths of American history that everybody had a roommate who was wearing a red coat. It just didn't happen. Okay? Which one was not part of the Intolerable Coercive Acts? There was a 5th act that was passed by Parliament at the same time, called the Quebec Act. That was not part of the Coercive Acts, though the colonists tried to make it part of it. The Quebec Act, remember, said that Quebec included the Ohio River Valley, that the official religion of Quebec was Catholic. Okay? The colonists were horrified. Which act helped precipitate or begin the revolution? The Hat Act, the Wool Act, the Molasses Act, the Tea Act, the Stamp Act. Okay, it's between the Tea Act and the Stamp Act, so which one is it? Tea, okay? The Stamp Act happens 10 years before, well, 6 years before the Tea Act, and more importantly, the Stamp Act is resolved because Congress, or Parliament, eventually does away with the Stamp Act for the colonists. The Tea Act is still in place when the war breaks out. So that's what precipitates the war. John Peter Zenger, a colonial newspaper editor, who kept writing articles about the governor of New York, whose name was Cosby. And he was very unflattering about Mr. Cosby and his actions. So they sued him for slander. They threw him in jail and arrested him for slander, okay? Or libel. I'm sorry, libel because it was printed. Slander is verbal. And he was printing these articles. John Peter Zenger's case changes American view of libel because in America we believe it's only libel if it's untrue. It's untrue. It's not true. Okay, John Peter Zenger was not writing untruth. He was writing his opinion or things that were true. Okay? In England at this time, if you criticized a public person, that was libel, and you could be put in prison. In America, that was no longer true. Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense, where he said it makes common sense to revolt, to establish our own country. Probably the greatest document in terms of pamphlet, propaganda pamphlet for the revolution. Okay, so the First Continental Congress met. The first thing they did was come up with a compromise called the Suffolk Resolve. It wasn't a compromise, I'm sorry. It was a petition to Parliament saying, come on guys, you want to be part of England, you've got to, do your part, you can't tax us, etc. Parliament finally answers the following year, but it's too late, and they say, fine, we'll give you an amount that we need and you can tax yourself. You can figure out how you want to pay it. If they had done that in 1763, it probably would have worked. They waited until 1775, 76, and it was too late. The second thing the Continental Congress says is to each of the 13 colonies, it's time to start preparing for defense in case we go to war with England. So start training your militiamen. So in New England, this is where the Minutemen come in, okay? The training of soldiers or guys in the community who can be ready to go in a minute. The third thing the First Continental Congress agrees to do is meet the spring of 1776 and reassess what's happened, okay? In December of 1775, Patrick Henry gives a speech in front of the House of Burgesses in Virginia, where he talks about the importance of revolution and freeing ourselves from that tyrant England. And his famous line is, give me liberty or give me death. Okay? The Declaration of Independence. Okay, so a little preface to the last part of this. The spring of 1776, Continental Congress meets again for what's called Second Continental Congress, which meets until 1781. The first thing they do is send a petition off to George called the Olive Branch Petition. Dear King George III, we love you, we love being your subjects, but get a grip on Parliament. Please do something for the colonists. What does he do? Nothing. He never replies. Parliament actually sends 10,000 more troops to Boston. The second thing that the Second Continental Congress does is set up two committees. The first committee, underneath the direction of John Hancock, is given the job of coming up with a framework of government. That framework of government will be called the Articles of Confederation. Okay? The second committee, and this now gets back to the terms, is set up to write a Declaration of Independence. There are 5 people on the committee. Do you have a question?
Oh, no, I'm trying to read that URL sign.
Oh, okay. The committee, Thomas Jefferson's on the committee, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, and a guy whose last name is Livingston. Adams says to Jefferson, you should write it. Jefferson says, look, Adams, I know you should write it. Adams says, no, people like you better than me. Jefferson says, you're right, write the Declaration, okay?